Okay, welcome everyone to this webinar on Chinese railroad workers in North America project at Stanford University. This webinar is a joint collaboration between the Center for East Asian Studies, or CEAS, and the Stanford Program on International and Cross-Cultural Education, or SPICE. My name is Jonas Edman, and I am an instructional designer at SPICE. SPICE is a program of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University, where we serve as a bridge between Stanford and K-12 schools and community colleges by developing multidisciplinary curricular materials on international topics, by conducting teacher professional development seminars, and teaching distance learning courses. We would like to take this opportunity to thank the Center for East Asian Studies for their support of this webinar, including CEAS Director, Professor Daphne Zuer, and CEAS Associate Director, John Groschwitz. In addition, we'd also like to thank Adrian and Monica Arima for their continued generous support of the Chinese Railroad Workers Project at Stanford University. So we are all adjusting to new realities wrought by this pandemic. For SPICE, this has meant transitioning to online workshops and seminars, which we feel very fortunate to be able to offer. In addition to responding to COVID-19, we have also been confronting the deep roots of racial injustice that affects all of society, including education. SPICE has a long history of highlighting unheard voices, and we are committed to lifting up even more voices in the years ahead. We are honored to be part of the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project at Stanford University and to be able to bring this webinar to you today. Upwards of 15 to 20,000 individual migrant Chinese laborers performed the bulk of the work constructing the Central Pacific span of the transcontinental rail line. Between 1864 and 1869, these Chinese also crossed the Pacific Ocean in what was then and may still rank among the largest transnational labor migration movements. How do we find sources to uncover this forgotten and deliberately erased history? What did they experience in their arduous work? How did they live their daily lives? What kind of enterprise did they innovate? How did their work on the railroad shape their lives in communities on both sides of the Pacific? To shed some light on these questions, we are delighted to have two excellent speakers with us here today for this webinar. First, we'll have Dr. Roland Xu, Director of Research for the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project at Stanford University speak. He'll speak for about 30 minutes. And following his talk, Greg Francis, curriculum consultant for SPICE, will speak and share some curriculum materials that can be used in schools. Following their talks, we'll have a Q&A session. And if you're just joining us, I encourage you to write your questions in the Q&A box. So it is now time for me to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Roland Xu, who is the Director of Research for the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project here at Stanford University. His publications address migration and ethnic identity formation, and he is the author of multiple essays in international scholarly collections and in policy journals, including Le Monde Diplomatique. Dr. Xu's most recent book is Migration and Integration. His writing focuses on history of migration and on contemporary immigration policy questions, combining humanistic and social science methods and materials to answer what displaces peoples, how do societies respond to migration, and what are the experiences of resettlement. Currently in the area of US-Chinese history, Dr. Xu is researching US receptions of Chinese intellectuals in exile who visited China during 1971 to 1981 in the wake of the Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon covert and public meetings with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. So welcome, Dr. Xu, and I'll hand things over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonas, and thank you so much to Sabrina for organizing and for Gary for your leadership of SPICE. It's really a pleasure. And I'm going to make sure to try and be faithful to my time, just 30 minutes, because the highlight really in my mind is when we get to Greg and the curriculum. It's always a pleasure talking to teachers. I love doing this because we're talking about how to transmit the advanced research and the findings that we've come up with at our project to the next generation of students. So the material I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to pack in a bunch of slides, so don't worry if you see a pretty large slide deck. I'm going to move fairly quickly because I want to get the material out on the table and then take questions. I'm going to frame this hopefully in a way that's useful for teachers, as I understand. I mean, you're really the experts, but I'm going to frame this in the sense of a set of questions that are intriguing, I hope, for you, for your students, but really, honestly, authentically, are questions that are still in play even after we've completed this multi-year research study. So that history at its best is a set of deepening questions that you continue to mine and continue to make more and more profound as you go forward. So to begin, let me share my screen to get to the slide deck here, and I'll move forward with some details. And what I'm going to include, hopefully you'll all see now my slide coming up. What I'm going to include are some original historical material that we've digitized so that you can get a taste of what's available in our publications. I'll highlight what those are, as well as what's available on the website. And so I've spent quite a bit of time curating the site with our team so that the site is accessible, inviting, and useful for anyone in the general public to go to and use them, use the materials. So to begin with, the first question is why? Why build the transcontinental railroad? I start with a historical map here. I'm going to have a lot of historical imagery. This one was actually commissioned for Jefferson Davis, then Secretary of War. This is before the Civil War. And on our website, some of these are more visible, some of the details. But the point here is that actually a lot of the lines that are longitudinal, that are horizontal from east to west, are speculated rail routes to connect east and west. So it was already a driving question and problem on how to transport population from the more heavily populated East Coast through about Missouri to the west. And rail lines was the first thought of speculation. And then I'm going to bring up here a map that shows it. So it's obviously a modern map that shows what we typically call the Transcontinental Railroad from Missouri to California. And of course, if you can see my cursor, we're focusing today on this red portion, the Central Pacific Railroad. So the Union Pacific completed the blue portion, and the Central Pacific completed the red portion in the 1860s. So to focus in on the Central Pacific Railroad is to focus in on the second question after why the railroad is why Chinese? And this is a very counterintuitive answer. That is, for anyone during the time in the 1850s, 1860s who would have thought of Chinese, the first image that you would have would be the image actually popularized by Chinese themselves in North America. That is, here's an image of a studio portrait that actually is from Yale Library, but it's among many. You can see actually it's formatted on a card. It's almost like a calling card, but it's a little bit more formal portrait. But this is actually the imagery that a Chinese man propagated of self for his own benefit. So you can see he's holding the attributes of scholar. He is in touch with the finer things of life, with a bouquet of flowers next to him, and he's in fine silk garb. This already, from the Chinese perspective, is not an image that would be advertising, I'm ready to do heavy labor. The second historical image is quite popular. You might have seen this before. This is actually held on negatives. It's in the Oakland Museum of California History. This is a black and white photo from the 1870s, so slightly after the construction of the Central Pacific Railroad, but it's actually one of the few we have that shows faces of Chinese who were working on the railroad. In this case, they were building a spur further south towards the city of San Jose. I bring it up to show you both who some of these faces were and also what we don't have from the Central Pacific Railroad. We'll be seeing the historical images literally taken during the construction. And there's one detail conspicuously absent from just about every historical photo taken during the construction, that is the face of a Chinese worker. And we'll talk a bit about that erasure. Here's another image that's quite iconic, and it's also from slightly later, from 1885. So it's another spur of a railroad line that's connecting with the Central Pacific Railroad. I included for two details: one, again, faces, as well as you may have seen this image, and two, for the garb, that is for the cotton tunic that they're wearing, as well as the hats of most. And we're going to recognize the garb, especially in some historical photos, to be able to identify Chinese. This is actually an example of how we as historians have to use multiple details from historical sources when we don't have literal positive historical record, that is, enumeration of names, dates, places. We'll have some of that, but we don't have the kind of historical records that some students may have grown to rely on or look for, that is a narrative of these men were brought here, they did this work, their names were this, their origins, their home places. Instead, we mine every historical artifact that we can, including, in this case, training our eyes to look at attire. So I'm going to keep moving through these slides, and I know Jonas will interrupt if there's a kind of a burning clarification Q&A questions, fine with me. Otherwise, I look forward to answering questions at the end. So this image here, as Jonas mentioned, is of a ship crossing the Pacific Ocean. This is an example of, from the gold rush time, 1850s, up to about 1859, of a steamship that crossed the Pacific. And just to give an idea of the power, so it's actually a coal-fired side wheeler they would use the coal for propulsion heading west, and then with the trade winds coming back, they could use some sail power. They had to stop at upwards of 12 ports on the way to Yokohama, and then finally to Hong Kong, Macau, to refuel their coal. That's all the ship could hold. I bring it up because this is a part of the story of the Chinese railroad workers that's not typically discussed nor well understood. That is, up to the time of the very beginning of Chinese men being employed for doing railroad work, this was the means to cross the Pacific. It took typically 45 to 60 plus days to make the transit. And in historical imagination, that is the length of time that most likely conveyed a sense of leaving home with no guarantee, nor even promise, nor even perhaps fantasy of returning home. On the heels of the Civil War, actually, Abraham Lincoln commissioned a new fleet of US mail ships to cross the Pacific, specifically with the rhetoric of making North America, United States, a global power. And so using the word global before we've coined it today, to connect with the Orient, Asia. And you could just get a quick idea of the difference of scale and difference of speed. So this is one of 4 new US Pacific mail ships that were commissioned by the Union to cross the Pacific. And the difference is also in human terms. They cut from 60, 75 days down to 30 days or fewer to cross the Pacific, with 3 ports of call. And that changed the impression of the trip leaving China to North America, one that was both survivable as well as return voyage was not only possible, but actually likely. And that's a detail that many also don't note, and certainly didn't know at the time, that the majority of Chinese who came for this contract labor had the intention, or certainly had the return passage possibility to return home. ships, again, this last image of boats is to convey how important actually the waterways were to the construction of the railroad. At the time, if you recall the map of North America, all a heavy industry building steel, that is the rails for the railroad, the steel for the locomotive engines and the rail cars, was all produced on the east coast of North America, in especially the steel mills around Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh. And then there was no rail, obviously, to bring these across. You're not going to bring these across on ox cart. So they were put on ships, loaded, sailed down the east coast of North America. Much of them were transited by mule train across the isthmus in what we now know as Panama, and then placed on new ships and brought up the coast. We do have the diaries of some sailors who came to see the railroad under construction, some white observers, and were sailing up the coast, observing what is now Baja California, observing the change of land. This is actually the wharf. It's called the Railroad Wharfs. This is a historical image by the photographer Alfred Hart. And so they've sailed up into the delta of the San Francisco Bay, and you can see they've loaded rails onto these cars, these rail cars here. They loaded the steel rails from these sailing ships. That's actually how they brought most of the heavy materials. So crossing the Pacific and then waterways is actually the introduction to the Transcontinental Railroad. I'm going to highlight very briefly here. This is an image, a still shot from our website. The way it functions is actually to turn our understanding of the railroad line 90 degrees. So typically, anybody who has looked a little bit at the history of the Transcontinental Railroad has seen this map here that I'm highlighting with my cursor. That is a two-dimensional map that shows, first of all, the circuitous route. And many can understand that in order to maintain a constant moderate grade of no more than 2% for a railroad to be able to climb, the engineers had to chart a circuitous path through the Sierra Nevada mountains. They had to climb from sea level at Sacramento over 7,000 feet at summit, and then down into the desert. And so to do that meant following quite a circuitous path. We've now turned this 90 degrees to this map down below it, which is an elevation map. And if you go to our website at any particular point, you will go to a brief detail that might whet your students' appetite about that place. These are not evenly spaced, these nodes, because these are geographic locations where we advise there's a preponderance of historical material, historical newspaper articles, archaeological findings and the like. So there's stories to tell and evidence to use in these locations. Bloomer Cut is a really interesting place. What we put on our website here is actually a historical image and a contemporary shot. So this is your first glimpse of the impressive feat of the Chinese railroad workers. This is a cut through a solid granite mountain, cut predominantly with hand tools. And today, so it's called Bloomer Cut. And today, this is the Amtrak rail line going through the same cut. So the legacy, this is our first glimpse of the legacy of the Chinese railroad workers, actually is the earthworks that they accomplished. There's more detail in here, but I'm going to go on to our next slide and get you more historical material. The question that I want to get to after why Transcontinental Railroad, why Chinese, was how was it possible to hire, as Jonas mentioned, 15 to 20,000 individuals to work this railroad? First of all, we have no evidence that any executive or manager of the Central Pacific Railroad spoke or read any Chinese or any of the dialects of those who came from especially southern China from the Pearl River Delta. So how is it possible that they could have located, hired, supervised, paid, monitored that many Chinese men? This was a question that has, and by the way, our research is on the backs of previous studies as well, which we honor, but no one had been able to answer this question or even to frame it in such clear terms until we came upon two things. And the first piece of historical evidence for historians, a really exciting find. And we give thanks to local historians in small community archives and museums, and an archivist in Placer County, so getting in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains, an archivist whom Gordon Cheng was in touch with, one day said, I don't know if this would be of interest to you, but we've kept this article from a newspaper from 1863, from the Placer Herald, and never really knew what to make of it. And so I've given you a blow up screenshot, and then I typed out the text. And it says, in brief, I'll furnish any number of Chinese workers, laborers, to work on railroads, wagon roads, or mining claims. Again, so you can already enumerate the different industries that were hiring Chinese at the time. These historical records are really cool. At the lowest cash rates, so he's offering market force here. Having experience in the business, so let's underline that too, saying, I've been in this business for a while here. What is this business? It's labor contracting. I have facilities for obtaining any required number of men. Reference William McDonald Auburn. And it's signed here, you can see Honghua in Auburn. This fellow, Honghua, is one of the first times we found a proper name for a Chinese man who names himself as working on the construction of the Chinese railroad. His own story will be interesting. We'll finish these 30 minutes today with the end of his life story. Another little detail to note here, since I typed out the whole newspaper clipping, is reference William McDaniel. We went to census records and found who this William McDaniel was from the 1860s. In Auburn. He was a prominent businessman who owned a significant industry in this town, especially for lumber mills. Lumber was so important for construction of housing, also for the railroad, the ties underneath the rails. And he was a member of the Chamber of Commerce. So he's a significant figure, Caucasian figure in the business community of this town. Here you have a Chinese man not only advertising his experience as a labor contractor, specifically to hire Chinese, specifically to do these types of construction projects, but also as a partner with a prominent Caucasian, a member of the business community of this community. This, for students, can really open the eyes, or at least raise questions to complicate the story of what was the experience of Chinese at the time in the 19th century. We certainly know of, and we'll get to at the end, the story of repression, both personal and political. We're also filling out their story with here evidence of business acumen as well as partnerships in the wider community. Let's see how I can get my slides going here. Okay. The other, I mentioned that's our first piece of evidence of how they hired and how they were able to maintain such a large workforce, Chinese. Here's the other evidence. It actually comes straight from the company itself. So you'll see I've blown up a page of payroll records from the Central Pacific Railroad. And by the way, I've also put in Stanford Library as well as on our website a collection of these shots of payroll records. It's a selection, and they specifically have Chinese names as well as a lot of data. So you can see on the top, just as a little teaser of what historians do with this material, is that, so we mine it for all sorts of information besides the date and time and place. So China Payroll was titled this page, and it's actually from a whole volume of payroll records that are labeled on the spine, China Payroll. And if you look at the top, we have actually the first line is Honghua. There's his name. By the way, of course, we can't say with 100% certainty it's the same Honghua, but the preponderance of evidence is that it is. The details are astounding. I'll only get into a little bit of it here. There is no actual total amount of pay for this Honghua, because as you drill down, you realize that he is employing subcontractors who themselves contract laborers, because each one of them has in total far more than per diem for a month's work. So each one of them is being paid for roughly, as we do the math, the equivalent of 15 to 25 workers. Each one of these names, by the way, most interestingly, it's one of the few we ever found, Honghua himself is collecting pay for subcontractors who are Caucasian, who themselves are distributing pay for workers. It's the only evidence we have in this enterprise of a Chinese man employing or organizing the labor of non-Chinese. He was really a significant figure. This is a larger text of a different page, again, Honghua, and just to give you a sense, there were other subcontractors, Bookwalter, Sisson, Wallace. These became the big companies that the Central Pacific Railroad turned to manage the employment of their labor. At this time in '66, so this is really up to the height of construction, if we went back to that map, when they were trying to surmount Summit, that is the peak, and beat the winter. They had to, that was probably the largest employment time. So, you know, this is spring before the winter is going to hit, before summer, then winter. Honghua is earning on aggregate 5 to 15 times the amount of pay of any Caucasian subcontractor at the time. That is simply by virtue of the number of people he's paying, the number of Chinese workers and subcontractors of subcontractors. He really had an amazing enterprise. And if you want more information about Honghua, there's a whole chapter on him in the book by Gordon Chang, Ghosts of Gold Mountain. I note his legacy. So this is from after the completion in '69. So this is in 1876. But you really see that Honghua's ad for laborers became a kind of a model for subsequent Chinese who wanted to subcontract, to be in that business of providing employment. So here's an ad from again, around a different newspaper, Placer Argus, but from Auburn, so from the foothills. And he deals in, this is once the railroad is running, he can provide, using the railroad, dry goods, foodstuffs, and clothing for the Chinese community, as well as he's an agent for Chinese laborers, any number furnished on application. And so it's really interesting to be able to find these historical tools. I'll note here how the enterprise, the construction was promoted. So this is an image of a stereoscope. So if you had a kind of a wooden pair of binoculars, you put these double image in, it gives you a 3D effect. They're starting to climb from the American River. I'm going to go through some historical images so you can see them. Another granite mountain carved by hand and loosely packed black powder, black gunpowder, but it's really carved by Chinese. So they were able to carve, you can see a single track, this is bloomer cut. We're going to go to, this is quite an iconic image. Today you can still see the Amtrak line uses this. It was a sheer granite cliff. They first had to carve out the roadbed out of the cliff, and then this is the very first train that the company construction is running to bring supplies for the next length of construction. Here's from the other direction. This is also one of the spots that's reputed to be the place where Chinese were lowered on ropes in baskets to carve out a niche into the face of granite, stuff in some gunpowder, some black powder, light it, and yank on that rope as hard as they could, pull me up, and before it exploded. And we have evidence that we've now come down to say it's likely that this happened. Here you see the costume from the time where you can, as historians, you begin to be able, again, no faces, but you see the attire of Chinese workers who are beginning or preparing to begin to carve the tunnels up at Summit. And then here again, not only were these stereoscopic images produced of the beauty of the place, but also of the physical manpower that was going to bring tourism to the place. So this was actually sold as a way to visit and see the scenery. There's the very beginning of one of the 6 tunnels carved in granite faces at Summit. And you have, it's quite a popular image here, a tea bearer posing for the camera. Unfortunately, again, no detail of face, but certainly identifiable for his costume. There is one of the tunnels, and I just go through some of these tunnels relatively quickly to give you an idea of the sheer accomplishment. So you could see now, and you can walk through Summit Tunnel. This is before it's finished. Summit Tunnel is near the parking lot for Sugar Bowl Ski Resort above Donner Lake. And you can get to it today and walk through it. It's more than 1,600 feet long from from west to east end. And it curves. And it was actually built in breakneck speed to try to beat the winter by 4 directions. The engineers calculated where it would enter and where it would exit on a curve. They had Chinese crews digging from both ends, as well as disassembled and hauled a steam engine to the top where they calculated to be the middle of the tunnel. And they used the steam engine to drill a shaft down to where they calculated the tunnel would cross, and lowered Chinese down to dig out from the inside. So from 4 directions building this. The other thing we're showing here, and it's a taste of it, is the woodwork. So Chinese not only carved, but also reinforced and built the snow sheds. This is an example of some of the kind of snowfall, 32 plus feet towards Summit. We also have evidence that as they were building the tunnels, when winter hit, there were avalanches, and more than 20 Chinese were buried alive, killed in the avalanches, and their bodies weren't able to be found until the spring. This is an example of a railroad snowplow from the time with a Chinese man posing down at the base. Examples more of the woodwork that the Chinese built. And of course, this is no longer extant. It couldn't survive all these generations, but it was originally built by Chinese, and there's some spectacular imagery. So these are snow sheds that are built out exiting the tunnels by Chinese, as well as, this is a spectacular image. Again, there's no extant material remaining, but it's a curving shed with roof, thatched roof, built by the same workers who built the rail. This is quite an iconic image, and it's actually the one that Sabrina began our presentation, our webinar with, a artistic rendering. This is a trestle that was built by Chinese to cross a gorge at the time. The Chinese were later brought back after the operation began of the railroad to replace this wooden trestle with earthwork. But in order to meet deadlines, they built this out of lumber, and it's over 1,100 feet long on a curve. And it's another image of it. All these sites are available. So that's the image that's rendered by an artist at the beginning of our webinar. And that image is on our website. It's actually from a magazine called Frank Leslie's Illustrated Weekly. It was something like, for those of you who are old enough to remember, Life magazine, or sort of like Newsweek or Time magazine, but more pictorial. And in this case, here you have the actual original historical photo, Chinese in the foreground, as well as coming up the ledge. They are pulling and also leading some mule carts, doing the earthwork underneath the wood trestles. That's Secret Town. You can visit the location today off of Highway 80, which transects the Sierra Nevada mountains. And in terms of where they lived, and I'm bringing this to a close now for Greg to take over, here's an image, actually the site of a rail car. This is the rail car of the superintendent of construction, William Strobridge. And those are, it's an image of Chinese looking at, perhaps speaking with the family of Strobridge. Again, is from behind, no faces of the Chinese themselves. Here, where else did they live? Here's the encampment. Here's an encampment of the Chinese. They lived in tent camps alongside, it's sort of nodes of the railroad construction. So the railroad materials would be brought up to a certain point. They'd lay out the camps. The Chinese had their own cooks. The cooks boiled water for their own tea, provided all the food for the Chinese. On the right, you get a glimpse of some of the housing for the white workers. Again, here's an image of a stereoscope for popular consumption, for tourism, to see the grandeur, the beauty of the construction. So they included a Chinese tent camp. No faces, but now here is an example of the this contrast on left and right. So the Chinese tent camp, and actually if you go with a magnifier or blow it up, you can see laundry hanging, cooking pots smoking and the like, but no faces, no individuals. And then the rail cars, including smoke from a cooking kitchen, that's where white workers stayed. The tent camps, a significant number of them became several of the historic towns along the Highway 80. So Truckee, originally a tent camp, and Cisco, originally a Chinese tent camp. These all became, because merchants would collect, would stop there and use that as base camp for supplies, and they became the towns. Colfax, another town, named after, at that time, vice president. It was changed from Illinois town to Colfax. That's the depot, again, originally Chinese. And this is an image just to give an idea of how the Chinese did their work of laying the rails themselves. So first cut the roadbed, then lay the ties, and then finally the rails. They're bending the rails. This is a posed or staged photograph by the photographer who has his wagon in the back there to show how he could do his work. There's a white superintendent supervisor. They're posing for using big iron bars to do the bending. This is the time when we come closer to having faces, but it's after they actually completed the work. And finally, the ending of the railroad construction was when East meets West. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroad met in Promontory Point, Utah, May 10th, 1869. The image here that we show, a stereoscopic image, shows who we identify as a Chinese man here and a Chinese man here by their garb. Again, no face. We have newspaper accounts that the Chinese crew was the one that completed the last rails. Here is an iconic image that was circulated across the country. East meets West, the two companies toasting each other. No Chinese, except we think we've identified. Here is a figure with his back turned, and we think the garb behind, whose face is covered by this man who's holding up his hat. Is this an inadvertent gesture of exclamation that just happened to obscure someone's face, or is it a purposeful erasure of someone's identity? Either way, those are the two Chinese who perhaps by accident remained in this historical photo of the team. This all was celebrated. The legacy of the construction was celebrated to heal the wounds of the Civil War. Does not such a meeting make amends? That is the way it was advertised, that the work of the two companies was actually the end of the fratricidal Civil War. It was advertised then. There were copious illustrations for promoting the business. It was a lucrative enterprise. Much of the riches that came to the company came from operating the railroad. And finally, that figure of Hong Hua, who showed such acumen and such capacity to provide labor. We found we think it's him, his obituary in 1935. He died a pauper in the town of Placerville, and apparently was sort of a character walking around town, suffering from levels of dementia, but people tolerated him, had various nicknames of disparaging terms, and he lived in a almshouse without any wealth. We also found historical evidence that his businesses were burned to the ground in a small town that became Truckee during the time in the 1880s of the anti-Chinese sentiment. So that's a sad way to end a story of a significant figure who represents a whole nother side of the Chinese experience. I ended now on this last slide with a colleague, Connie Young Yu, one of the team of scholars from our Railroad Workers Project, who just this year and the 150th anniversary was able to give a speech with proclamation to restore the historical presence of the Chinese in the construction of the railroad. Thank you very much, and I look forward to taking questions and hand it over to Greg.
Thank you so much, Roland. Just want to check if everyone can hear me. Jonas, are we good? Great.
Yeah, do you want, I can give you a introduction.
Brief one's fine.
I'll give you a brief introduction. So Greg is a curriculum consultant for Stanford Program on International and Cross-Cultural Education. He's also works for the with the California School Boards Association. And with SPICE, Greg has authored numerous curriculum units, including Along the Silk Road, Security, Civil Liberties and Terrorism, International Environmental Politics, and China's Cultural Revolution. And he's also created curriculum materials for the Railroad Project. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, and let me just make sure I'm getting this set up correctly. So can you give me a thumbs up if you're seeing the title screen here?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone. My name is Greg Francis. I am a curriculum consultant with SPICE. And our role is to take the scholarship at Stanford University and translate that into lessons and materials that are relevant for high school and community college audiences and meet the standards that those students are expected to cover. We work with many different departments and institutes at Stanford, and we were really excited to work with the Chinese Railroad Workers of North America project. Really, the scholarship of Roland and his colleagues is the basis of what we've done. We've taken all that scholarship and created 4 lessons that are geared towards students who are in high school or community college. What I'm going to do with our time right now is I'm going to give you a brief overview of those 4 lessons, just kind of go through what happens in each of them, and then we're going to actually take a little bit of a wade through 3 of the activities we would have students do, just to give an idea of the types of things that we're asking them to look at and analyze and respond to. So the first lesson is really helping students familiarize themselves with the Chinese Railroad Workers of North America project and its website and all the great tools there. Roland showed you that interactive map, which takes people to different locations and shows the elevation and the photos and the artifacts from each area. It's a wonderful resource. And so this first lesson is really focused on having folks delve into that, try to find some things on there. We have kind of a scavenger hunt. We also ask them we start off by asking them to know the difference between a primary source and a secondary source. And you can see here, we have them watch a short news clip, listen to an NPR conversation. And then towards the end, students will listen to an interview with Maxine Hong Kingston, who wrote this seminal work of Chinamen in the late 1970s, which was really based on a lot of the history of Chinese immigrants, including the Chinese railroad workers. It is a fictional work, but it was really based upon that. So we have students examine that, and then to synthesize all this, they create a performance from the perspective of a Chinese railroad worker. And one of the themes you'll see we find is how do we, how much do we know about the lives of these workers? And out of all the different sources we have, what do we have the most faith in, and what might we have to extrapolate? And Roland got into that, and I'm sure we'll go through that in the Q&A. The second lesson focuses on the how U.S. society at the time responded to Chinese immigration and assimilation, and really delves into the immigrant experience. We want students to learn about the exclusionary laws, which many students don't know about, and how that impacted the Chinese community and how the community responded. We also want to make sure that students understand that there were various Chinese immigrant experiences that differed from depending on when immigrants came here. We really want them to understand how some of that might explain people's perceptions of of Chinatown, the early Chinese immigrants today. And we continue to ask students to analyze primary and secondary sources. So what we look at here is we look at some of the political cartoons from the time around the issue of Chinese immigration. We have students look at some of the writings of Chinese at the time. So as Roland mentioned, there wasn't that much of historical records from the railroad workers themselves, but other Chinese immigrants did leave some writing. And we also have students look at a series of fictional letters from Mark Twain, which are quite inciting. What he does is he writes from the perspective of a Chinese immigrant who is coming to the U.S. and seeing it as this land of opportunity and no discrimination, and kind of satirically describes his disappointment and the reality that many Chinese immigrants faced. So that's, I think, a great perspective to see that someone who was a white American could see that the way many of the immigrants treated was not consistent with the country's values. And then finally, students will watch a documentary of a Chinese family whose ancestors came to the San Francisco Bay Area, and how their life has changed through the generations. It's kind of an example of the different waves of immigration. So let's take a look at some of these political cartoons. There's three, and these are all from Harper's Weekly, which most of us will not know because it ended publication in 1916, but it was a political magazine published in New York. And this one is called The Chinese Question. This is from 1871. So I just want to take a moment and give everyone a moment to look at this. And in the Q&A, just send in a couple of impressions of what do you think is trying to get across here? What do you think this political cartoon is trying to say? Someone said very negative. Any other reactions here? All right, Chinese laborers needed to be saved from the tyranny of the white mobs. Yeah, that's pretty close to what this was getting at. So the caption here, and this is one of the downsides, right, of not being in a large room where we can see this more clearly. You'd have to zoom in, but the caption does say, "Hands off, gentlemen. America means fair play for all men." And so what we have here is this is Columbia, which is the feminine symbol for America, and she's supposed to represent America's values. And she's basically defending the Chinese immigrant here with the common haircut against a mob of men who are coming. And these are these pictures are stereotypes of Irish Americans and German Americans. And on the wall, you can see a bunch of epithets that they were using to describe the Chinese. So some of the things you'll see here are barbarian, vile, heathen, rat-eater, and vicious. And the Chinese question was really the issue of whether Chinese immigrants should be allowed in the United States, which already in the 1870s became a heated issue, especially in the West in California. So once the railroad was complete in 1869, many of the workers went on to other big public works projects, other railroads. But many of them were out looking for other work. And the 1870s and 1880s was a time of economic stagnation in the United States. And so, especially in the West, people would often blame the Chinese for the lack of work. And so starting in the 1870s, this was there was a big push to stop Chinese immigration. And this ended in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which we'll get to in a moment. All right, the second image I wanted to show, and again, these are all from the same publication. This is called the New Comet, a phenomenon now in all parts of the US. And so take a moment and chat in what you think is going on here. And again, unfortunately, it's hard to see because we have a small screen, but also just the quality of the original is not the greatest. This is from 1870, so a little bit earlier than the previous one. All right, we see some are trying to shoot down the cheap labor is one impression. All right, so what we have here, and this just is also just an insight into how people used to refer to China at the time. China was often called the Celestial Empire during this time. And so one of the terms people used to refer to Chinese people was the Celestials. And so this cartoon takes that image to be the comet. So the celestial imagery, you see the comet there, that's meant to be the Chinese people, and it's labeled cheap labor. And so at this time, large numbers of Chinese were immigrating to New York. And this cartoon is really showing how New Yorkers were reacting to the Chinese who came. And so this is not, entirely negative. Some of the faces, if we could see closer, some of, the expressions here are curious. Some are welcoming, others are afraid. So there's kind of just a divided opinion. On the left side, near the factory, what's supposed to be the factory there, you can see it kind of labeled here. You see some people who are business people, pro-capitalist, who seem optimistic about their contribution. And on the right side, with cheap labor here, you see people who are more skeptical and are more worried about that economic competition. And so it's just showing a mixed reaction, but overall, the impression of this is showing that people regarded them as something very exotic and strange, and something to be viewed with curiosity and mysterious. So that's kind of the impression here. And this last one is really interesting. So this is called E Pluribus Unum Except the Chinese, and this was published 1 month before the Chinese Exclusion Act was enacted, which was 1882. And it is showing, again, that people were aware of the irony of having this motto of "out of many we are one," and then excluding a group based upon nationality. So the Chinese Exclusion Act is the only time that the U.S. excluded a group of people based specifically on their nationality. And so what we see here is the U.S. it's called the label the Temple of Liberty, but it actually looks like a feudal castle with heavy guards and a mode and someone here checking papers for people to be able to come in. And the ones who are excluded are Chinese there. So these are things that we show students as part of this lesson on immigration and assimilation. And I just wanted to share that with people. The third lesson is on human environmental interaction, and this leans on kind of that topographical map that Roland showed previously. And so here we take students through a slideshow on the different sections of the Transcontinental Railroad, and we show them, the project has a great library of resources of historical, when the railroad was being built and what that section looks like now. So we take students through those images and just really get them to see what does it mean to build a railroad in these types of circumstances. And so they really look at that, and we have them answer questions as they view each of those images. After that, they go back to the website and go through the images and again, answer some questions based upon that. We also really want students to hear the oral histories of descendants of the Chinese railroad workers. So we'll look at those in a moment together. And then we ask students to say, okay, no one actually was able to interview the workers themselves. We're interviewing their descendants. Let's pretend you could go back in time and be a journalist interviewing them. What questions would you ask? And let's create an interview. So we have students do that. And then they listen to the song Men of Iron, which is a song about the railroad workers. And we ask them to create a song commemorating them as well. And so for these oral histories, we've taken the interviews of 8 descendants that are that folks who worked with the North America Project did. They spent a lot of time locating people whose ancestors worked on the project and getting their stories and trying to capture as much as possible and learning about what documentation they had and trying to piece together the stories. So we really want students to look at that partly as a primary source, but also we emphasize it's not actually a primary source because we're trying to see what people who are descendants knew about their ancestors and how much they knew it. So I'm not going to read through this, but I'm going to keep it up for a moment just so you can see an excerpt from one of the interviews and just see the types of information the students can get. So I'm just going to keep this up for 1 minute, and then there's a part 2 to this too. So I'm just going to let people read through this. All right, I'm going to move to the second part here. Okay, and let me just tell you why I wanted to share this one. You can see in this with the interviewer is really trying to understand what are the sources of this descendant's knowledge, what records does he have, where does it come from, how did he find it? So you can see students in doing this will be able to see the thought process and the work of recreating history. This one also, as you can see here, the respondent explains, why he explains why we don't have written documents or haven't been able to find any from this time so far, and Roland might be able to speak to. I think last time we spoke, he said he still holds out hope we might find something, but you can see sort of the issues that emerge in records from that time, but he does have, as he mentions in the previous slide, he does have the records of the family tree, so he knows who was in his family and where they moved to, at least that he came to the US. So just really interesting here for people to see what we do have and don't have to reconstruct the lives of these people. And then again, the following activities, we ask students, okay, you just read an interview of someone interviewing a descendant of a railroad worker. Imagine you could go back and try to capture the history with a worker, in the 1860s. What would you want to ask, and just what do you think the answers might be? So that's kind of the activity there. And then let's look at our last lesson here. Our last lesson is focused on San Francisco's Chinatown. And we wanted to focus on this because Chinatown in San Francisco was very important to the Chinese community, and it was, its existence was very intertwined with the railroad workers. So the workers, almost all of them came to San Francisco and would spend some time in Chinatown or meet with their contractor before going out. They would come back there for recreation, to try to get in touch with their family, mail things back to China, money, letters. Chinatown itself benefited from the size of the community and the money that railroad workers received. And it also just really loomed large in shaping the perception people had of Chinese in general during this time around the United States. And so we wanted to kind of delve into that and look at the interplay between Chinatown and the railroad workers. What we have students do is we have them compare two maps of Chinatown, and I highlighted that because we're going to look at that. We have them read and compare depictions of Chinatown. So there were depictions written by Chinatown residents, so we do have that. And there were many depictions, and both, we have some photos, but a lot of writing by non-Chinese. And there's a very clear divide in terms of the non-Chinese depictions focus on the vice of the area, and the Chinatown residents focus on the familiarity and the safety they feel there, as opposed to other areas in San Francisco. Professor Gordon Chang, who is one of the co-directors of the project, gives a short lecture on the history of San Francisco's Chinatown. And then we end this and our whole curriculum series by asking students to work in groups to design a memorial to honor Chinese railroad workers. And we ask them to place that in Chinatown. So we have them do that and do a gallery walk to view the memorials of their colleagues. And that we feel like is a really good way to try to wrap this up. As we know, especially from our current moment, who we choose to memorialize and the way we choose to depict them has great symbolic meaning. And we want students to try to think about how these workers should be memorialized and what they would want to tell others and what they would want others to remember about this group of really remarkable contributors to the history of the United States. So the last thing I'm going to show here is just a couple maps that illustrate the difference in how a drawn map can really highlight different aspects of a community. And so shortly after the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, the Board of Supervisors, which is the governing body of San Francisco, asked a committee to draw up a map of the Chinese quarters. And this was really actually meant to be a companion piece to a report on vice and disease in the city. And so this is the map they came up with. And again, it's too small to see the legend, but they marked out certain institutions, including gambling centers, opium dens, theaters. And so they're really kind of just highlighting the Chinatown as an area of vice and paganness. And this is, one of, I think, the very few early maps that was created, and so this kind of cemented people's opinion in the wide and English-speaking community of what kind of a place this was. One thing we get into the lesson again is for the Chinese depictions, they really emphasized the ability to find familiar foods, familiar drink, to be able to send things back to home, to go to the theater. There were many theaters showing traditional Chinese opera and theater, and troops would come from China, and that's one of the things people really emphasized. And there were also clan organizations that brought people together and formed a strong sense of community. So that's what you see in the Chinese descriptions, but here, not so much. And the second, which is very different, is a map for tourists to San Francisco Chinatown. And this is a walking map, which is created and distributed by the Chinese Historical Society of America. And we also just, encourage people who do get a chance to visit Chinatown to see that there are several buildings there that come from some of the early days, and that there is a lot of that history that is still present. And so you can see at the bottom, we ask students to reflect on a couple of questions. How have the boundaries changed, and what features are highlighted in each map, and how would you explain those differences in terms of the time, the moment we are in history, the audience, and who's creating it. So with that, I just want to say thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Jonas. He's going to be able to field the questions that you send in. So please keep those coming in. And he'll direct them to either of us. You can say if it's for Roland or for me, or Jonas will be able to direct it accordingly. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Greg, for that excellent presentation and for sharing so many good resources for the teachers. And thank you, Roland, as well, for your excellent presentation, sharing incredible photos, images, and shedding light on the life of Chinese workers, as well as shedding a light on how historians go about piecing together their history. So we have quite a few questions. And we only have about 18 minutes left. So we'll try to go through as many as possible. To start out with, there were some questions here about how to find the photos that you used, Roland, in your presentation. One here says, in the beginning of the presentation, you showed a photograph of Chinese workers showing their faces. Can you clarify where on the Stanford Chinese Railroad Workers Project website we can find that image? And similarly, where do we find the image of the tea bearer?
Yeah, so the photos are really popular. And so there's two best sources. Quite a few of them are on our website, but it's not our focus because they are in public domain. So the two photographers are Alfred Hart and Russell are the two. And the tea bearers, I believe, is a Hart image, and they're all available on Stanford Library. There are multiple copies. So if you go through our website, under the link, I'll just show you real quickly, the page, yeah, well, I'm not seeing my, I won't share it right now since I can't find it. Anyway, on our resources page is a link to the Stanford Library and link to the Alfred Hart collection, the album of photos. A lot of those are the landscaped images as well as the tent camps and such. The tea bearer is part of Russell's collection. They are all digitized and publicly available through the Oakland Museum of History, Oakland Museum of California History, something like that. Again, on our website, I give the links for those. And they're really well digitized too. You can zoom in, you can, if somebody really wanted to use it for our website or something like that, you can ask for permission from the libraries, and they tend to be very supportive.
I can just jump in. I think there's 2 or 3 questions I saw about why was it that there are so few images of Chinese workers' faces. Was that a norm, or was that a intentional effacement? So a few people asked that, and Roland, that would be something you could speak to.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great question to leave us historically imagining. That is, if you look at iconography from the time, both contemporary as well as traditions they're drawing on, it seems to be both ethnic and class. That is, portraiture, you know, formal, where you could really see a face and see individuation, individual details, was more like a studio portrait people would pay for and produce, like even that Chinese image, or the image of the Chinese man, were versus let's say in cities, images that were photographs being taken of street scenes, when they went to poorer parts of town, the details don't individuate figures. And then finally, workers are quite rarely individualized. So it's a much more, you could benignly say it's a much more modern notion to give individual detail to someone who's not from the elite. Then of course, as Greg, you're pointing out, from the period of anti-Chinese sentiment, it would really run counter to caricature if you gave individual detail.
Okay, great. As a follow-up, Yu Li, we have a question here. It says, what do you know, what information do you have about the photographers and who they worked for? Perhaps that would shed some light on how the photos were taken and why.
Those two photographers were quite prolific, Russell and Hart. So they made quite a living on their own. Nobody hired them to do that work. They came on to do their albums. They're making those stereoscope images, selling them. They had whole studios. Most of their market was on the East Coast, as well as magazines. So these are part of larger portfolios that these two had. In a sense, they're precursors to Ansel Adams, because as much as they're, I'm cherry picking images that show people, because we're interested in the Chinese themselves. Really, most are, especially Hart, most of his images are of the terrain. And he's one of the early precursors to aestheticize or show the beauty of place as a work of art.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Aaron Williams here. Do we know much about how someone like Hung Hua would have related to the people he subcontracted? For example, would the relationship have been defined more as one of paternalism or one of exploitation? Or perhaps neither of these things?
Yeah, it's a great question. We don't. I'll be honest. I love to point out areas for future study. Really, the evidence I showed you is some of the best parts of the evidence to show basically the scale and aggregate numbers to do the math to extrapolate how many. We don't even have the individual names of, let's say we calculate that he himself, we find the records for him to have collected the pay for several thousand workers. We don't have the names of those workers. He didn't leave written records. The Central Pacific Railroad never had to enumerate those people because it had the contractors, the subcontractors. So that's to underline that we don't know even how he paid them. We have evidence that individual workers collected pay through gold coin, that's what they preferred, because at the time there were multiple paper currencies in the US. With the Confederacy in the North, Southeast. So paper money was even, the Chinese were certainly able to tell that was pretty worthless if they moved from a place. So we know they were paid most likely in gold coin. A lot of the gold coin was transported as remittances. This is in the publications that I put out, back to China through grocers. So we know that much. But after that, we also don't have evidence that Hung Hua himself would have supervised the work, that is verified that the performance of the work. it's more likely that white bosses were supervising the actual construction. Honghua was really the prototypical administrative bureaucrat collecting the money, taking his cut, and making the pay.
Speaking of pay, Bill Kwong asked, the income made by the workers was considerably a lot more than what they would have made in China. Can you give an idea of how they compared?
Well, we know two comparisons. One, that the Chinese were paid at most about 50% of what white workers were paid for the same kind of work, as well as having to pay their own expenses, food, equipment, clothing, which whites didn't have to pay for out of their own salary. And the other comparison sort of longitudinally across the Pacific, that's a great question that, we have a wonderful set of colleagues in China who have been trying to unearth the evidence of the impact of the transnational migration of labor, both to North America as well as Southeast Asia, Australia and the like, to the coal mines and the like. And they are able to catalog remittance receipts, that is, funds flowing in, what it paid for in terms of architecture and the like. I haven't seen them do an economic history to compare, besides to convey that it was quite a windfall for money to come from outside.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Catherine Martin, who says, thank you so much for all this information. I teach elementary music. There are many railroad work songs, but they're usually of African-American and Irish origin. Are there any work songs of Chinese origin, and or can you point me to resources to look for these?
Yeah, there's, so in the book published by Stanford University Press, our Gold Mountain book, I actually co-edited a couple of chapters that have the lyrics to songs, as well as, so those are in print, links to recordings of contemporary, that is now, the way these lyrics may have been performed. So these were essentially, from what we can say, these are songs that were popularized at the time and are still remembered today to convey the personal cost of the dislocation of Chinese, especially men who left the Pearl River Delta. So they tend to be songs of mourning, of lament, of sadness, of sisters, mothers, brides left behind. And they're really beautiful. So we have the lyrics in Chinese and then translated into English. And then I have links to some recordings of the way they were performed with a tok, with a wooden hammer, marking the rhythm, sort of like rap music of the day.
So are those links available through the website, or is that through?
It's in the book.
It's in the book. Okay,
yeah, it's in the book. Yeah. So if you and most libraries should have a anyway, major libraries would have a copy. That is so that's not Gordon Chang's book. That's the multi-essay scholarly publication of Stanford University Press. It's on our website under publications. And so it's available in a lot of libraries, and it's there are 3 chapters that I co-edited there, and the one of them with Zheng Guosheng from a Wuyi University focuses on those ballads.
Okay. Next, we have a couple of questions here about Chinese workers after the railroad was built, or how many returned to China. So Bill Kwong asks, any idea what percentage of workers stayed behind, or what percentage went back to China after the completion of the railroad? And Matthew Tovar asks, after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, what happened to the demand of railroad workers and the workers themselves? Were there more railroad projects, or did they have to find other work? The construction, oh yeah, so I guess those 2 questions.
Yeah, I think Greg, you alluded to that too, that so the first part of that question about return home, we know that a significant portion return home. It's ongoing research to quantify because you have two variables in play. One is how many died during construction, and there's controversy about that. There's journalistic accounts of some railroad cars by Central Pacific Railroad bringing boxcars full of bones of Chinese back to Sacramento. And then we have, as historians, the macabre task of calculating the average weight of a Chinese man's skeleton at the time and dividing out the math and calculating the number of individuals in a boxcar. But then even that is controversial. So once you subtract that number, we also only have spotty records of ships manifests of how many actually came from China to do, and we have to extrapolate from there how many total were there. We don't have complete records of the payroll to be able to literally do the math to find how many were ultimately employed. That's why Jonah mentioned in the very beginning, 15 to 20,000. All that's not to apologize, but to say how historians do their work, so that ultimately we know that a significant, perhaps more than half, certainly were part of the transit to return home. There were some who returned again because of the shipping was so much faster. So then we, you know, if you're talking 15, 20,000 were employed, then more than half of those returned home. Much to even though that was really denied by the anti-Chinese sentiment of the time, which was that it would, you know, it would contaminate the population of the West and such.
Speaking of how historians do their work, there's questions here about whether you found any letters that were sent back to China by laborers, and also if you found any records of disagreements regarding strikes that the Chinese workers used to fight against abuses exercised by this white superiors.
Yeah, so the two things in brief: letters home, no personal letters, as Greg mentioned. And there's different stories about why. And we do know that there was a degree of literacy of many of the workers, because we do find some signatures that we could extrapolate to convey levels of literacy. We do find remittance contracts with signatures and names, but we don't have personal letters or diaries of any of those workers. And this is something noted by our predecessor scholars as well. The second about strikes, yes, there was a very significant strike during the construction leading up towards Summit Tunnel. It's perhaps the largest, I didn't have time to get to this, but it's in American labor history, it is certainly looks to be the largest of its time labor stoppage. And it's striking in its scale and magnitude that, as I mentioned, these tent camps are spread out across the line of 600 miles of the construction. And yet somehow the Chinese were able to communicate across the line so that they all put their shovels down at once. And were striking for, we think, for better wages. That they understood they were only being paid half for the same work. We also know that the construction foremen and the heads of the company, Stanford, Hopkins, and the like, panicked, and word spread that they were on strike, and the company was going to lose its subsidies from the federal government if it didn't meet its deadlines. The story that the company spread is that they starved out the workers because they stopped bringing supplies up the line. And it does seem to be that's what happened. However, the other side of the story, and there's a whole chapter of this in Gordon Chang's book, Ghosts of Gold Mountain, specifically on the strike. The other side of it is that within a short amount of time, the company payroll records show that they increased the pay rate for the Chinese. So whether it was literally in response to the strike or whether the strike pushed them over the edge, they did get some increased wages.
Okay, thank you. So we are just about out of time. I apologize if we weren't able to get to your question, but I would I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank both Dr. Roland Shu and Greg Francis for being here and for sharing your expertise. And I encourage everyone to join us for more webinars in the future. And this webinar is being recorded, and we will be posting it on the SPICE website. So feel free to share the link once it's out and let other people know. And that concludes this webinar, and thank you everyone for joining.